Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. After criticizing a number of other philosophical perspectives, Velleius, the Epicurean, in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, Book 1, is going to turn to the big rival in the work, namely the Stoics. He says, lastly, Balbus is the Stoic here, I come to your Stoic school. And what he's going to do is enumerate a number of positions held by various Stoics. And occasionally he'll say, well, this is kind of a silly idea. But for the most part, he's setting them out just as if they must be crazy thoughts that only a crazy person would actually hold. There's not a lot of actual argument there. And I think before we look at this, it might be helpful for those who don't know that much about the Stoics to get a little reminder of just what it was that the Stoics in general held about God, the divine, these sorts of matters. So we can talk about a standard Stoic perspective of antiquity. This doesn't really hold necessarily for contemporary advocates of Stoicism, since there's a great deal of variance among them. So what would be really key to the Stoic thinkers and texts that we have? One is that God, and you could say God with a capital G, sometimes talked about as Jupiter or Zeus, is this logos, this rationality pervading the totality of the entire universe. Not something outside, transcendent to the universe, as we're going to see with Abrahamic monotheistic religions, by contrast, but a sort of pantheism in a way, or panentheism. There's some debate about this. And then a really important doctrine that goes along with this is that this, God within the universe is not only rational and living, but good and wise, and carries out providential governance of the totality of, you could say, of itself, but you could also say of the universe as a whole. A common phrase that you will find, for example, in Seneca and in Epictetus is that we inhabit, if we choose to, a commonwealth, a city or state of gods, lowercase g, but also uppercase g, and human beings, that we as rational creatures have a certain role to play. Sometimes this is talked about as us having a little bit of divinity within ourselves. The Stoics also engaged in allegorical interpretation, or we could say reinterpretation of traditional viewpoints on the gods. So, for example, they're not going to say any more than Socrates would that the gods engage in conflict with each other or cheat on each other sexually. Those are stories told by poets, and all the stories are either false or they can be allegorically interpreted as referring to something else, something that is truer and more meaningful. And then the last thing is that the Stoics, interestingly, were, for the most part, committed to divination, something where Cicero is actually going to write some books combating their doctrines. What is divination? Consulting the gods or the divine to find things out. Like, it could be, what should I do? Going to the oracle at Delphi. It could be knowledge about what's going to happen in the future. And sometimes this was tied in with astrology, the study of how the stars not only move within the sky, but how they influence human affairs within this world below the moon, as the ancients talked about it, the moon being the closest heavenly body. So that's, you could say, the standard Stoic take, and Velleius is going to be combating this by way of mentioning it, again, without an awful lot of argument on his part, some derision, some condemnation, some just laying out what the doctrines are as if only a foolish person could believe this. And he's going to talk about a number of different Stoic thinkers, all of whom are involved in what we call the Old Stoa. It's interesting that he doesn't mention anybody from what we call the Middle Stoa, a little bit closer in time to him, which would include Panaetius and Posidonius, with whom Cicero is very familiar. And, why is that the case? Why not look at the closest representatives? Well, one advantage that they had in ancient times that we have lost is that they actually had the books by all of these people. Chrysippus, one of the most prolific authors in antiquity, they had his books. Same thing with Zeno and Aristo, Cleanthes, Perseus, Diogenes of Babylon, many others as well. So, we're getting some little snippets here of what it is that these people talked about in their works. So let's look at each of these in turn. He's going to claim that Zeno is a bit incoherent. What does Zeno actually say? So first, the law of nature is divine, and its function is to command what is right and forbid the opposite. And then Velleius says, how he makes this law out to be alive passes our comprehension, but we expect God to be a living being. So if the law of nature is going to be divine and gods are alive, well, then the law of nature must be alive. But Velleius says this doesn't really make any sense. In another passage, however, Zeno declares that the ether, this fifth element, is the God. If there is any meaning in a God without sensation, a form of deity that never presents itself when we offer up our prayers and supplications and make our vows. Now, that could also be said about the Epicurean perspective as well, that the Epicurean gods don't get mixed in with human beings. So Velleius is playing a little fast and loose here, or Cicero is representing him that way. And then he says, in other books, he holds the view that a reason which pervades all nature is possessed of divine power. So this is the logos, right? And then we get some allegorical interpretation. He attributes the same powers to the stars, or another time to the years, the months, and the seasons. In his interpretation of Hesiod's Theology, a very important early Greek text, he does away with the customary and received ideas of the gods altogether. He does not reckon either Jupiter, Juno, or Vesta as gods, or any being that bears a personal name, but teaches these names have been assigned allegorically to dumb and lifeless things. So that is what we're getting of Zeno, and the idea here is that these ideas don't actually fit together well. Some of them don't seem to make an awful lot of sense, and they diminish our conception of God. Now, the next three thinkers we get are students of Zeno. Cleanthes actually will become Zeno's successor. Aristo goes off and starts his own kind of spin-off. Perseus also has some interesting ideas as well. So Aristo, according to Velleius, thinks that the form of the deity cannot be comprehended, cannot be understood, intelligere. And he denies the God's sensation and is in fact uncertain whether God is a living being at all. So this is considerably different from Zeno's position. And Aristo is not really a Stoic. He's kind of the founder of his own school, which is very minor. Then we get to Cleanthes. Now, we're going to get Cleanthes also accused of inconsistency. Cleanthes at one moment says the world itself is God. At another time gives this name to the mind and soul of the universe. And at another decides the most unquestionable deity is that remote, all-surrounding fiery atmosphere called the ether, which encircles and embraces the universe on its outer side at an exceedingly lofty altitude. So, three different positions that Velleius is saying Cleanthes actually holds. Three not entirely compatible positions. God is like the highest part of the universe, the ether. God is the entire universe. God is the rationality and soul pervading the universe. If indeed Cleanthes actually held these three positions, he was indeed incoherent. So he goes on and he says, he babbles like one demented. So, sort of just a personal attack there. Now imagining gods of some definite shape and form, now assigning full divinity to the stars, now pronouncing nothing as more divine than reason itself. So this is a real problem because these can't all be God in the same sense. So what is the Stoic conception of God? And this is a leader of the school who is supposedly taking these positions. He goes on and he says that Perseus, now here we're going to get to the allegorizing and also we could say anthropomorphizing of God, says that men of deified persons who made some discovery of special utility for civilization, and that useful and health-giving things of himself been called by divine names. He did not even say they were discoveries of the gods, gods themselves, deorum, but rather of them as actually divine. And so here we actually get an argument being made by Velleius, other than, hey, you're inconsistent here. What could be more ridiculous than to award divine honors to things mean and ugly, or to give the rank of gods to men now dead and gone, whose worship could only take the form of lamentation? In short, these things, if Perseus is actually right, aren't worth being called gods or being treated as divine. Then we get to Chrysippus. And, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of space devoted to Chrysippus here because Chrysippus wrote an awful lot, of which we have only passages. So he says, Chrysippus musters an enormous mob of unknown gods, so utterly unknown even imagination cannot guess at their form and nature, though our mind appears capable of visualizing anything. For he says divine power resides in reason and in the soul and mind of the universe. He calls the world itself a god and also the all-pervading world soul. Again, the guiding principle of that soul, which operates in the intellect and reason, and in the common and all-embracing nature of all things, and the power of fate, and the necessity that governs future events. Besides this, the fire I previously termed ether, also all fluid and soluble substances, such as water, earth, air, the sun, moon, stars, and the all-embracing unity of all things. Okay, so that's already a lot of different things being called God or gods, and even those human beings who have attained immortality. So what is the complaint here? Well, there's too many things that are being labeled as divine. Which isn't Chrysippus? And I mean, Chrysippus could respond and say, all of them. All of these things are divine. We just have an awful lot of divinities, right? And he goes on and says, he argues that the god whom men call Jupiter is the ether. Okay, so there's some allegorizing going on there. And Neptune is the air, which permeates the sea. Goddess called Ceres is the earth. He deals in the same way with the whole series of the names of other God. He also identifies Jupiter with the mighty law, everlasting and eternal, which is the guide of life and instructress in duty, which he entitles necessity or faith and the everlasting truth of future events. And then Velleius says, none of these is of such a nature as to be deemed to possess divinity, right? So you can call these gods, but you're wrong in using the term God to say that cereal, Ceres or Demeter, the goddess of grain and harvests and growth and all that, just call it that. Don't call that a god. Don't call the ether Zeus, or if you want to talk about an all-pervading reason throughout the universe, just call it Logos. You don't have to call it Zeus or Jupiter. You're not adding anything by seeing this as a god. He goes on and criticizes Chrysippus a little bit further, and he says that this is what is contained in his Nature of the Gods, Book 1. In Book 2, he tries to reconcile myths of Orpheus, Musaeus, Hesiod, and Homer. So that's a lot of literature there, with his own theology, and makes out that even the earliest poets of antiquity were really Stoics. So, that's kind of a far-fetched idea. Do we know whether Chrysippus actually held this idea? No. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Maybe Velleius is an unreliable narrator. We don't really know. And then he mentions briefly Diogenes of Babylon, the fifth scholarch, and he tells us that Diogenes followed Chrysippus in this allegorizing, and he rationalized the myth of the virgin goddess, that is, Minerva or Athena, from Jupiter by explaining it as an allegory of the processes of nature. Now, it would be interesting to know what exactly that's supposed to mean. All we get is this one line here. And clearly Velleius thinks that this allegorizing is not a useful strategy for making sense of physical processes. Just call them what they are. Don't make them divine. And he thinks that the other, issues or ideas within Stoic theology are ultimately incoherent and, you could say, not great to follow as well. So this is his all-out assault, we could say, even before the Stoic gets to speak on the Stoic position. Now, in Book 2, Balbus the Stoic is actually going to lay out what the Stoic position is, but we have a preemptory attack or critique of the Stoic position by the Epicurean, and these are the main points that are being raised as objections to any correctness to the Stoic position.